So over the next few slides, we're going to be talking about very broadly what industrial organizational psychology is. And to really talk about industrial organizational psychology, we first need to talk about what exactly is work. So these are not really necessarily technical terms, but one of the things we want to think about is what is good and bad work, what is good or bad jobs, and what is a good versus a bad career. So there's two things we're talking about here. First is the difference between work, jobs, and careers. And the second is the difference between good and bad. So industrial organizational psychology, part of the goal of industrial organizational psychology is to better the workplace, to better jobs, to better careers, and to better the work. So think of the work as what you actually do on a job. So a part of my work is creating this lecture. A part of my work is interacting with students. A part of my work is doing research. At one time, I used to work in construction. A part of my work there might have been cutting wood to a certain length. It might have been driving nails. That's work. That's the work that we do. So work is usually more focused on the tasks. Now again, there's good work. There's work that's enjoyable. There's work that you look forward to do. There's work that you feel that there is value to. But there's also bad work. There's work that you're not that interested in. So within my job as a faculty member, sometimes the interactions that I have and some of the committees that I have to sit on are basically, in my opinion, not a very good use of my time, and I would consider that bad work. That's a part of my job, a task that's required that I don't see a lot of positive aspects coming out of, not a lot of actual development. I don't enjoy doing it, and I'm not even sure it really gets anything done. So part of what IO psychology can look at is how do we actually make the work or the tasks themselves at a job better? Jobs are packages of work, if you will. So a job is basically, a role in an organization. So you have a specific job at an organization. So when an organization hires you, they're hiring you to do a job, which is a series of tasks that is associated with that job. On a construction site, that might be carpenter, that might be bricklayer, that might be plumber, that might be electrician. In a university, that might be a research professor, a teaching professor. So there's different jobs. And again, IO psychology is about trying to find ways to make jobs better. There's both good and bad jobs. And I think if you thought about your own experiences with work, with jobs, you probably could think of jobs that you've had that you've enjoyed that were relatively good. And you can think about jobs that you've had that might have been not as enjoyable, or bad jobs. And a lot of times we think of this just in terms of pay, and that is definitely an element. A good job often is one that pays more. A bad job is often one that doesn't pay as well. And finally, we have the idea of careers. So a career is an individual person's series of jobs that basically are all in the same field. So I've had multiple jobs as a faculty member. I have worked as an instructor. I have worked at other universities, and so I've held different jobs. I've also worked just in a research aspect where I was working at a university doing research, and I've also worked as a consultant at an organization where all I was doing was applied consulting. All of those were individual jobs, but my career as a psychologist is something else. And again, IO psychology often will focus on trying to help people create better careers and to have organizations think about how they can establish an organizational structure that helps people have good careers. So a famous quote that I'm very fond of is from Martin Luther King Jr. It's, if a man is called to be a street sweeper, he should sweep streets even as Michelangelo painted, or Beethoven composed music, or Shakespeare wrote poetry. He should sweep streets so well that all the hosts of heaven and earth will pause to say, here lived a great street sweeper who did his job well. And what this is getting at again is the fact that what I take from this quote is that each person needs to determine what work they enjoy, what type of jobs they want to do, and what kind of a career they want to have. And then it's their goal to figure out how to make sure that they're doing good work at a good job that becomes a good career. But industrial organizational psychology can help by trying to help organizations establish good work, good jobs, and good careers. So, the importance of IO psychology. As I was already saying in the previous module, or part one of this lecture, The importance of work in most people's lives. So work has a strong aspect and a strong part of the identity of many people. And IO psychology is that application of psychological principles, theories, and research to the workplace. And there's a strong kind of focus in industrial organizational psychology not being too much in one or the other of the two worlds that we can look at when we talk about a field of science. And that's the idea of academic research and practice. So most professionals decide if they're wanting to focus more on kind of an academic or research focus in their professional lives, or if they're wanting to focus more on practice. IO psychology has put a strong premium as a field on doing both. So if you are a consultant, an IO consultant in an organization, doing practice in the workplace through consulting, through working with private organizations, or even in public organizations, you should also be still well-versed in what research is going on in IO psychology and how to do research. And also, if you decide, like I did, to go into academia and become a professor or a research psychologist, then you should not be just doing academic research. Most IO psychologists, even in university settings, are also usually busy doing consulting work and still working with organizations. So there's a very strong focus in the field of IO psychology on a mixture of research and practice. It's often called the scientist-practitioner model. And the idea that all IO psychologists should be both. They should be scientists and understand how to do research, how to read research, and how to interpret research, but they should also be applying that research through practice in organizations. So continuing on, what is psychology? Psychology is about helping people do their jobs, and it's to the benefit of both the organizations and the individual. So IO psychology is focused on both making organizations function better, function more efficiently, function more profitably. It is also about making sure that the individuals in that organization are being treated fairly, are being treated justly, are being treated without discrimination or bias, and are also more satisfied and enjoying their jobs. So we're helping people do their jobs. We help employers treat employees more fairly, to understand biases that can occur in the process, by helping making jobs more interesting and satisfying, and finally helping workers to be more productive. One of the major theories that drives almost all of IO psychology is the idea that PE fit is one of the easiest ways to get to success in organizations. What PE fit represents is P is people or person, and E is environment, or quite honestly, in this case, organizations. So PE fit is a general theory that basically suggests that if you want to find success, you need to match the characteristics of the person with the environment. And that can be not just in organizations, but in psychology, IO psychology, what we're really focused on is trying to measure people, measure traits, measure aptitudes, measure knowledge, measure skills, and then match that with measurements of organizations, of work, of jobs, of careers to find a good fit. And the idea that if you find a solid fit between the ideals, the goals, and the abilities of the person, and the goals, the ideals, and the required abilities of a job or an occupation, then you're going to have a lot more success than if you don't do this. So PE fit is one of the driving concepts of IO psychology. I'm going to talk a little bit about generally IO psychology, what makes IO psychology IO psychology. One of the things that makes it is that there is actually professional organization devoted to kind of defining and advertising, if you will, or promoting IO psychology, and that is Division 14 of the American Psychological Association, and it's referred to as the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology, or PSYOP, pronounced PSYOP. Never say SIOP. That is not the way that we talk about it in the field. And like all fields, we have our own jargon. So IO psychologists will often talk about being a member or going to the conference or even standards that have been created by PSYOP. So not only does PSYOP provide an online community and a network for IO psychologists to communicate to each other, it hosts a yearly convention where thousands of IO psychologists gather to both share best practices and also share most current research. And finally, it actually is a political organization as well, basically advocating and advertising IO psychology in general. So as I mentioned earlier, there are three broad concentrations of IO psychology. There's the personnel part, or the I in IO psychology, and this is also often seen more as directly mapping on to HR or human resources. And again, it addresses issues such as recruitment, so how to get people to apply to organizations, selection, so measuring that P of the PE fit model to find people that fit well with the organization, training, so once someone is in the organization, basically being able to determine what skills that person needs to be good at their job, and if they don't have those skills, how to train those skills. Performance appraisal, being able to actually measure accurately who is your top performers, your adequate performers, and maybe your lower than adequate performers. How to come up with fair ways to do transfers, promotions, and terminations, basically focused on organizational decision making. Then the second main field is organizational psychology, or the O, and it combines research from social psychology and also from business and organizational behavior research, and addresses the emotional and motivational sides of work. So as I said, job satisfaction, leadership, group function, that's all coming in more on the O side. And both of these, you can see, move towards the idea of improving the workplace both for the organization and for the people in the organization. And as I said, the third concentration is often referred to as human factors, sometimes human engineering, and it studies the capacity and limitations of humans with respect to particular environments, and it's usually human-machine interface. There are definitely graduate programs that focus on human factors, and in a way, it's almost its own subfield. It's considered a part of IO. People that do human factors are usually a member of PSYOP, but you usually find one of two types of IO psychology master's programs. IO programs that focus on the I and the O, and then human factors that just focus on that human factors. And as I previously mentioned, it sometimes is strongly connected to an engineering program as well. So let's talk briefly about what the IO psychologists do from the two sides of the I and the O. So on the I side, we apply psychological principles to basically human resource management. So anything that would be decision-making or human resources in an organization, let's apply psychological principles and methodologies to improve those systems. A lot of focus is on measurement of individuals, so identifying knowledge, skills, and abilities, but also measuring that E of that PE fit model. So measuring the organization or measuring individual jobs. And a strong basis of this idea is job analysis, and we'll be talking about both of these major parts in this class. How we measure the knowledge, skills, and abilities of individuals or people, and then how we identify what knowledge, skills, and abilities need to be had in order to perform a job analysis. To develop and validate tests to measure these knowledge, skills, and abilities in assessment and selection, so how to measure it cheaply, efficiently, and with high utility amongst people. To determine training and developmental needs, and to also develop and evaluate training programs. I often kind of refer to the I side and the O side, and I like to make a reference to Star Wars. A lot of people do look at the I side or personnel psychology as a little bit more like the dark side of the Force, in that it is more focused on organizational outcomes than individual person outcomes. So I side psychologists are not often talking about job satisfaction or lowering stress in the workplace, or how to motivate people better. It's more about finding the right people for the right jobs, and the bottom line often is saving money or making money for an organization. So I-side psychologists are often working more at the higher levels and with management, because a lot of I-side is about managerial decision making. So again, human resource management. However, what's kind of different than that, as far as the viewpoint of it being the dark side, is that when you do these things, when you apply industrial organizational psychology to these kind of decision makings, you generally find that not only does the organization get more profitable, the people in those organizations also are more satisfied because they are a better fit. You're finding people that are a good fit for that job, and when that happens, they're also probably going to enjoy the work more. So the O side, or the light side of IO psychology, studies behavior in organizational settings, but it mainly focuses on the individual. The goals here are basically making individuals more satisfied with their organizations, small groups functioning better, leaders functioning better. So we mainly examine organizational structure. So at the organizational level, an O-side psychologist basically looks at the culture of organizations, the overall systems, the justice within an organization, possibly the technology it uses, how you can set up organizations to be more just, to be more efficient. That's a little bit more of the O side. But again, the outcomes are usually not necessarily is the organization making more money. It's, are people doing good work? Do they have good jobs? And do they have good careers? So it's more directly focused on individual improvement. It examines organizational behavior, individual needs, motivations, attitudes, so job attitudes, both positive and negative, and also interpersonal and group-related process, and leadership and teams. And as I said, the third factor is human factors, and we're not really going to talk about that much in this class because this class is focused on the I and the O, industrial organizational psychology. And human factors, though considered a part of IO psychology, is it's really its own subfield. We'll talk about it a little bit more when we're talking about the history of IO psychology and how it fits into that history, but that's about all we're going to cover. So if you're interested in human factors, I strongly encourage you to look for resources, and you can also contact me on the message boards if you'd like me to point you in some directions to look into this more. So basically, again, human factors helps develop environments that are compatible with workers, focuses on tool design, workspaces, information displays, how we process information, how we visually process, how we audio process, studies the effects of work environment on employee well-being, safety, psychological stress and strain, and also helps design ergonomically sound physical environments. So, as I was saying, broadly speaking then, when we're looking at industrial organizational psychology, the two main things we're going to focus on in this class is the industrial side, which includes recruitment, selection, classification, compensation, performance appraisal, and training, and the organizational side, socialization, motivation, occupational stress, leadership, group performance, and organizational development. Now let me just briefly talk about each one of these. So on the industrial side, with recruitment, we're going to talk about using psychological science, the knowledge of survey methodology, to basically determine what works in recruiting the most number of candidates for a job opening. How, based on scientific research, can organizations do better at getting more people interested in applying to their organization? Once you have a pool of applicants, how do you select the very best applicants for the jobs that you have? And we're going to focus a lot on that selection aspect because a lot of IO psychology is going on in that selection part. Because to do selection, we have to be able to measure both the P and the E of the person environment fit model. We have to be able to systematically define what a job is and what the job entails and what's needed by an individual to do the job, and then we need to measure individuals to find someone that's a good fit for that job. Classification is more about, once we start doing that measurement, how do we define what makes jobs different from each other? When do we need to basically look for different traits for different people in organizations? So how do we classify people, and how do we classify jobs? So where do we draw the line of when a job is different enough to be called a different type of job? And when you think about organizations you may have worked in, you can kind of get an idea that this often happens. A lot of organizations will have some broad classifications of jobs, but if you actually look from person to person that has that same job, they do different things. When I worked construction, there was 5 of us that were basically labeled as carpenters, but each one of us had our own kind of specialty area of what we knew to do and what we often did on the job. And our jobs, the work we did, was actually fairly different from each other. So that may have actually not been a very good classification. Compensation, so focusing on once we actually can define what a job entails, we can also start using scientific methodology to try to calculate what compensation should be for that job. Performance appraisal, measuring and defining what is performance. And again, when I talked about selection, I was saying it's really important that we measure a job to begin with, job analysis, that E of the PE fit model. You also need to do that to be able to really be able to define what is good performance in a job. Now, some very simple jobs, it's fairly easy to come up with what good performance is. If you're a salesman, well, how much money do you make every month? That would be pretty easy for performance. But if you're looking at more complex jobs, like middle management, like a research engineer, like a faculty member, performance can become pretty complex of what exactly do you measure. And finally, training. How to create training, how to determine who needs training, and how to evaluate if the training is working well. On the O side, socialization involves, once you actually go through, and all of these kind of interconnect, by the way. So think about it. On the I side, we have recruitment and selection, convincing people to apply to an organization, and then finding the right people for the job once they're in. Once we've made the decision to select someone, let's move on over to the organizational side. Now, socialization. So how do we make sure the person feels welcome, basically gets oriented to the organization, becomes loyal to the organization, has commitment to the organization? What processes are best at getting that done. And now that they're in the organization, how do we motivate or lead them to do better? How do we make sure that occupational stress is being managed well, that they have tools to manage stress in the job, especially for high-stress jobs? How do we help leaders do a better job of all of the other of reducing stress, of motivating, of socializing those employees? If they're working in groups, what do we know from social psychology and other fields of psychology about making sure a group performs at optimal levels? And finally, how can we structure an organization to where the communication from layer to layer is actually the most efficient for getting the job done? So, as I said, IO psychology is very focused on this idea of the way to answer all of these questions is through a combination of science and practice. That we want to be able to draw from past research, to be able to read current research, to look at the academic side of IO psychology, to draw our theories and to draw our plans when we are going into organizations to create their selection systems, to create their performance appraisal systems, to help them set up groups and teams. So it's the idea of that science practitioner model. Every IO psychologist, whether they're working in an organization as a practitioner or whether they are in an academic setting as a scientist, should be doing both of these. The scientist should be doing research that directly applies to work settings and should, at least to some degree, be actually working in those work settings. And the practitioner should be drawing on this knowledge to directly apply things to their own workplaces, but to also test them themselves. So one of the big differences between, say, an HR professional and an IO psychologist is an HR professional very well may do many of these steps. You need a new selection system? Well, let me do the research. Okay, the research says that we should be using this technique to hire people, and here it is. Let's go for it. An IO psychologist would probably go through that exact same process, but once the company started using that new selection device, they would probably run studies. They would collect data and find, is this new technique actually helping the organization be more profitable? So, some people might disagree with me, but I've always kind of thought of, if you're wanting to try to differentiate an IO psychologist from an HR practitioner, or even from someone with a degree in business or an MBA, I believe that the model is that a business professional, someone with a business training, an MBA training, or training as an HR professional, is very well educated broadly in research, but their main focus is on the practice side, not as much the scientist side. So they know the techniques that have worked in the past, and they know kind of the best answer, all things being equal, for most situations. So they have a good idea of, all things being equal, this is what we should measure to select people. All things being equal, this is how we should motivate people. The advantage to an IO psychologist is an IO psychologist knows that it depends, that none of the theories that we have and none of the techniques we have works in all situations or works as well in all situations. So a lot of research, for instance, has shown that more helpful or altruistic people that go above and beyond to help their coworkers, is a positive thing. But it's actually not a positive thing in all situations. If you're in a job that has very high safety requirements, in other words, working that job requires you to constantly be on alert and focused on your task, because if you're not, someone could be seriously hurt. In that kind of job, very altruistic people that are always looking out to try to help others is actually a liability. So, the IO psychologist knows this is most likely going to work, but we need to test it to make sure it's working. Another way to think of it is both the IO psychologist and a business professional have some knowledge. Think of it as they both know how to be a mechanic if the organization is a car. The IO psychologist, if properly trained, is also an engineer that knows how to change the car if it's necessary. Well, that's the end of your intro today on industrial organizational psychology. Hopefully I've whetted your appetite to learn more. We're going to talk about pretty much the practical application of all of this, what IO psychology does in the workplace, and how and what it looks like to be an IO psychologist.